Hello, everyone. We're back. Another Friday evening, at least our time, wherever we are. Broad or Northern America, North America region, wherever that is.
Coming at you coast to coast.
Coast to coast. There's a reference. Oh man, it brings me back to my childhood. I wish I could have just a small fraction of Art Bell's vocal talent. We're doing some more weird right stuff. And today we're specifically going to be looking at our notion. Others have written about this. We are taking it and doing our own thing with it. Our notion of the time war. In this episode, you all will hopefully have the time of your lives, and you'll have never felt this way before. But we swear, both Elliott and I, that this is true, because we ultimately owe it all to you, because without you, we don't have a show. And we will never put you in a corner, and that is enough bad jokes to last the rest of the calendar year, at least. Hopefully some people got that. Cool.
About 1 month. About 1 month.
Yeah, 1 month. Yeah, about 1 month. It's not Swayze's best. Swayze's best film is definitely Point Break, but that's a topic for another day. Elliott, hope you're doing well. Pretty good, hopefully. You're here.
Oh, I'm doing great.
Energized. So that's
I am like 2.5 margaritas down. Like, let's go.
Well, I am 2.5 glasses of Pinot Noir in, which will probably we'll both have different chemical reactions to what we've been consuming. So it'll hopefully balance in the end and we'll get a good episode. We'll see.
Drug philosophy is the best.
Oh, it's the only way to philosophize.
Really,
okay.
though.
Elliott, not to put you on the spot too much, but again, even though I started this show, I very much, defer to the people I have on who are experts in things that I am not. This whole notion of time war, you turned me on to this whole notion of time war. So without putting you on the spot too much, give us a general introduction to what but specifically you mean by time war in the context of the weird right. So that's my best attempt at an intro. I pass it to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, here's the deal is that like I heard about this notion of a time war. Obviously, like if you're into like Doctor Who or whatever, you'll have heard about, Time Lords and fucking around with time and all that stuff, right? Here's the thing. I learned about this particular version of the time war from one of the CCRU, the Cybernetic Culture Research Units, essays called the Lemurian Time War, meaning lemur, right? There's the lemurs of Madagascar. It's sort of like a great example of continental philosophy on top of, fiction, which tends to get very self-referential and douchey pretty quickly. But when I read it, it was really freaking cool. If you haven't read the Lemurian Time War, go read it. And if you don't understand it, look up enough postmodernism to like start understanding it. But it's actually pretty cool. It's really cool stuff. And essentially, what this version of the Time War posits is that there are forces who are moving forwards and backwards in time who are trying to battle for reality proper. Now, the way we usually think about battles for reality is only forwards in time. And that's a very modern way of looking at it. And I know that some people might want to say that's a very Christian way of looking at it. And that's kind of true, but it's kind of false because Christianity has
we have the eschaton.
Time. You're right. You've got the eschaton, right?
Which is
that's
time
fair.
Beyond time. That's the thing. It's right. Like
yes.
It is beyond time, actually. And I mean, Christianity is also full of this whole idea of like God exists outside of time. So yeah,
right.
I mean, yeah, it's a very
right.
Maybe modern Christian way. It's a very like evangelical way of viewing the way that the universe.
Right, because there's a couple of different ways that you can view time, right? And I tend to think about them in terms of math. So I'll do this briefly, and people who get it. The people who don't. We'll keep explaining this in different ways. But basically, there is the straight infinite line of time that goes in both directions. There is the ray of time, which starts at one point and goes off in infinity one direction. There's a cyclic time where you can't really tell whether it started or ended. There is, kind of a what I would say is a looping a looping interval, right? So you can imagine a finite interval from like 0 to 1 or whatever. And, when you get to 1, you just teleport back to 0, kind of like a Groundhog's Day sort of situation. And you can think of like a time spiral, maybe, where it spirals in or it spirals out. And it could be circular as well. And I think about that kind of as mythic time. So an example of mythic time is anytime you participate in the Eucharist. That's an example of mythic time. You're either commemorating or you're consuming in some fashion, different Eucharistic theologies aside, with Christ and or Christ's sacrifice, depending on which denomination. But you're also really in any denomination of Christianity that really does hold on to Eucharist. It's more accentuated in some than others, but you are also communing with every other person who has ever communed. Right. It's as if you collapse.
And whoever will commune in the future.
Right. And the way I like to think about that sort of thing is like, so if you imagine the first 2 versions of time where it's an infinite ray or an infinite line, right? You can think about the Eucharist as certain points of like, say, a sine wave, if this makes sense to you. But just imagine like a normal C wave that's going up and down, right? And it touches the line at certain points. And those points are the Eucharist, right? Like they're the point at which, the kind of wave of Christ's death and resurrection touches our manifestation of reality. You can imagine 2 different waves: a small wave, high frequency wave, touching a bunch of times every Sunday, and a bigger wave touching every Easter, right? And potentially Christmas, depending on how you want to do that, right? But essentially, like, these are examples of mythic time. And the reason why I bring them up is because largely in the current materialist scientific way, we tend to think about time as either the ray or the line, and we totally ignore mythic time entirely, right? And it's important for us, and again, it's not the Reformation's fault per se, it's more the Enlightenment's fault, right? Where we started to think in terms of our myths as like, oh, when did mythic time occur in our coordinate space-time? But I think that ancient peoples didn't think about, say, Adam and Eve as occurring in, so to speak, the same universe as theirs. It's not that it's not real, it's just that time you can think about as another dimension, maybe, that is influencing our dimension, but like, it's kind of like Lord of the Rings. It sort of exists, but it kind of doesn't exist at the same time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm totally a goy and totally not an expert, but I do know from what little I've read about Jewish mysticism, there's just volumes of rabbinic traditional literature about like, this mystic quality of like when did Adam and Eve happen, right? Like that's like a whole, there's just like pages upon pages written about in both Christian in all Abrahamic traditions, right, about like what that really means, right? So Christian perspectives, Jewish perspectives, Muslim perspectives on that, and it ranges from like hyper literal, like it happened at this time and the world is 6,000 years old or whatever, and you're like, okay, that's one way of viewing the world, I guess. But then it also a lot actually would argue that for the longer tradition of those faiths, the understanding was far more in mythic time, that this is real. It's not that it's not real, it's that it's real, but it is not like you couldn't quantify that time and place. Like you said, the position, you can't quantify like when did atoms like exist in this one constellation. It's like, well, but this is something that's transcendent and mystical. So thinking of it as, if you're going to go hyper modernist, a different dimension. And it is interesting. That's a really good way of viewing it, or at least introducing the idea of mythic time.
Trying to get a modernist to think like a mythicist, right? Like, goddamn,
but the thing is, modernists will go like, oh, like in like that one movie, a different dimension, and it's like totally fine for them. And it's like,
right, they understand what it means as long as you can put it within sort of a material reality framework, right? Yeah. But it's interesting because they kind of require this sort of, in a certain way, autistic, okay, we are talking about, it's sort of like kids. I think about mythic time, not exactly like this, but similar to like when kids play Let's Pretend, and when a stick can become any object in their mind that they want. and they will insist that the stick is a sword. If you call it not a sword, if you call it a stick, they're going to get real pissed off at you.
Yeah.
Right. That is an example of mythicism touching our reality. And the fact that, like, you know, modernists require, like, okay, everybody, we are playing Let's Pretend, and the safe word for when we're ending Let's Pretend is gonna be blank, right? And you're like, oh, what a killjoy, right? Like, let's just all play Let's Pretend like we are kind of meant to as humans, right?
Yeah. Well, and this connects back to what we've talked about, you specifically, but have pointed out in a previous episode that you know, with the Enlightenment comes sort of this disenchantment of at least the West, and that implies that something strange and kids innately grasp this. They live in an enchanted world, and the idea that the enchantment that the world holds is one of those childish things that you put away when you grow up was never a thing up until very recently.
Because we had stories that kids would learn and that adults would continue to be enchanted by. I think the best example of the way that our society kind of breaks this is through Santa, right? Adults, in a certain kind of cynical way, purposefully set up a kind of anti-mythic mind virus with Santa, and then inoculate them against these sorts of mythic entities by saying, oh, by the way, Santa is real and nobody believes in him. And this I think is the first break that many kids have with mythic space, and where many kids go off the rails, right, with respect to mythicism in general. And so they certainly start to, oh, mythic shit is fake shit that adults lie about and cynically lie about to kids, right? And just separate them from adulthood. And adulthood is moving into this Enlightenment modernist space, which is post mythicism, right? And I think that's a great example of that, if that makes sense.
No, that's very well said, and that holds true, I think, for most people in, you know, most living generations, at least in America, would probably have a story similar to that, whether it was Santa or something else. But
correct,
right,
because it's like in ancient societies, Santa was never not real. He was always real for the entire adults and children. Even if the adults put out the presents, he was still thought to be real by everybody, and everybody continued to play the Let's Pretend game, even if they half believed it, half didn't believe it, right? Like, and it kind of both mattered and didn't matter if people believed it all the way or did not believe it all the way, right? This is where we see, like, sort of, in my opinion, ancestor worship and shamanic traditions where it doesn't really matter if people believed it or not. Like, it's like psychology is beyond just like a pure mechanistic, like, I am a robot and I need to be reprogrammed by the therapist. I mean, because the tools that the therapist uses are tools that actually make sense to a human, which isn't like, okay, you need to think these better thoughts. It's like, oh, well, how does that make you feel through your emotions? Well, emotions are kind of fake in a certain way, right? I mean, we experience them, they're real, but they're a little bit of a delusion at the same time relative to their materialistic explanation, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah. No, I'm with you 100%. Yeah, so mythic space. So mythic time and mythic space. How so in the Weird Rites take on Time War, what role does mythic time play?
Yeah, and so this is where I think it gets really, really cool, because I need people to think about, so how do we, it's a really deep philosophical question that physicists have a decent answer to, in my opinion, and it's, how do we know that time goes forward, and how do we know that it only goes forward, right? And their answer, physicists' answer is entropy, and entropy is usually frequently very dumbly explained as an egg breaking on the floor, right? And Nick Land specifically makes fun of, well, he kind of points out how silly this particular notion is, because it's like, look, if your notion of entropy is something that seems to be a thing breaking into many pieces that are difficult to reassemble again, then you're going to get tricked by things that spontaneously assemble, and you'll think that they're going backwards in time. But I don't think Nick is trying to avoid this eventuality, but I think it's interesting to note that our notion of time is entropy, which is basically things becoming unpatterned, right? Things eventually becoming more similar to white noise, so to speak, than to a structured form that you can see and observe, right? I think that's a much more careful version of entropy in kind of a few seconds. And you know, it takes longer to explain it for realsies, but that's the best I can do, you know, just verbally, you know. So essentially Land points out, hey, if your notion of time going forward is an egg breaking, and your notion of time going backward via an egg flying together through different parts, then and this is where I come in, and I don't know if I'm original in this, but I kind of don't care. Fair enough. Yeah. Is to say that, look, the left wing is the egg breaking. They are towards entropy. They want to they want to cause chaos, right? To deconstruct orderly structures. And that's literally what that means, right, is deconstruction. In critical theory, critical is to attack, right? And all of these things, I think we went over this in another episode, I won't belabor the point, or to clear, right, to remove the categories by which you could separate things from each other. So the right wing is frequently the opposite of all this stuff, right? And so the right wing is an egg flying together miraculously, AKA time going backwards. And so that's where the hope, we've talked for a while about people trying to summon Cthulhu, and if you're, you know, good with your probability, you're like, well, statistically speaking, somebody's gonna summon Cthulhu. And so this brings us to our first couple of bullet points here, which is we are in an eternal time war with Cthulhu. Don't look too long at Cthulhu when you fight him. And then in unsummoning Cthulhu by deploying anti-entropy weapons aimed at the roots of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the weird right wins the time war, right? And I'll pause for a brief second.
You're channeling Land better than I can. I've just stopped trying to, because only Land, who's read Land, knows that he has a very distinct style, and you're very nicely channeling him here.
Yeah.
So deploying. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No. You do it. I was going to take a victory lap, but victory lap is achieved. Go ahead.
Trophy. You won a trophy. Deploying anti-entropy weapons. So, expound upon that for me, if you would, since you wrote this section. Yeah.
No, for sure. So part of this is just Landian, right? And it's just kind of fun to write in his style, because a lot of people go, lol, what? And I'm like, great, that filters out the fucking normie philosophers. You know what I mean? Only the people who actually care will bother.
It's purposely
right.
Yeah.
it's a little bit purposely obtuse. It's slightly douchey. I get it. You know, honestly, like apparently Foucault was asked, by the way, I don't know if this is true or not, I haven't looked at it super carefully, but he was asked, why is your writing so opaque and hard to understand? He's like, dude, you can't be taken seriously in France unless your writing is opaque and impossible to understand. And that's fucking true for philosophy.
Yeah.
So there you go. Right. Goddamn academics.
Yeah.
So okay. So all right. So here's the situation. Deploying anti-entropy weapons, right? Okay. So obviously deploying weapons, if you know any militaristic things, there's a little bit of poetry here, right? Well, they'll say we're deploying a weapons platform. That's kind of why I chose to use deploying here. And then anti-entropy weapons. Okay, anti-entropy weapons are anything that would cause order to form. Now, anti-entropy weapons. Yeah, putting stuff like that back together, right? And so either it's reversing time, right, by employing a mythical time to either stop linear time or to literally reverse the flow of time. And again, this does mean actually, you know, they'll say you're trying to go back to the 1800s. In some ways, yeah, that'd be great, right? So are there specific tools that we could use to undo some of the things we can do? Nick Land would say, no, we can't. We're kind of stuck in this accelerationist situation. And so I'm not saying we need to decelerate the acceleration. I'm saying we need to accelerate in the totally opposite direction if we're to go outside of this black hole. And that isn't just meant to be kind of like an contemporaryist, right? It's also meant to actually say, in order for us to decelerate, we actually have to overcome the accelerationist urge, which is an enlightenment urge, right? At some point, we have to say, no, we need to actively forget some of our knowledge, which sounds pretty dark to people who are enlightenment. But when you see the enlightenment as dark, then it's light, you see.
Yep. Yeah. Well said. Yeah.
So let me see. Where do you want me to take the quote from there?
Wherever you want to. This is your section.
Okay. So in
By the
Unsummoning
way,
Cthulhu,
we will publish this at some point. We're using these episodes also to kind of iron out some stuff here too. So I know I had at least one. I talked to one viewer today, and the viewer was like, "Hey, are we going to see this stuff at some point?" I'm like, "Oh yes, we are. It's just we're working on it slowly." So view these episodes as teasers, if you will. All right. So
exactly. And I was trying to figure out what the fuck we're saying.
Yeah, pretty much. Okay, so it is coming. It is happening. Yes. Okay, Elliott, continue.
Okay. So in Unsummoning Cthulhu, I was like, man, once Cthulhu gets summoned, you're kind of fucked, right? So
late.
how would you, right? How would you defeat Cthulhu for real, right? I mean, obviously the Christian could say, oh well, God, blah blah blah. I'm like, yeah, whatever. That's boring and fair enough. I mean, it's a correct solution. It's just not as it's just not as fun. Right. So in kicking around for a fun answer, I was like, wait. What if we unsummoned Cthulhu? What if we went literally backwards in time from him? Right. And so in Unsummoning Cthulhu, by deploying anti-entropy entropy weapons, right, the weird right wins the time war. Now, I skipped a key part, which is that aimed at the roots of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that's essentially like, hey, the only real way to unsummon Cthulhu is by undoing the damage done by eating the apple or the mushroom, as you will, depending on your theory. The mushroom theory of the Garden of Eden is a little bit of a crackpot theory, but it's still fun.
That's very Joe Rogan. It's very Joe Rogan.
Well, it's pre-Joe Rogan, but yes, indeed, very Joe Rogan of me.
Popularized it, yeah. Yes,
indeed, to our modern audience. But it's interesting to note. Okay, here's the thing: is that the knowledge of the tree of good and evil really should be thought of, from what I understand from the sources I've read about Jewish understandings of this sort of thing, is that the knowledge of the tree of good and evil might as well be called the knowledge of the tree of A to Z, aka of all knowledge. Right. So you'll notice that Adam and Eve, before they eat of this tree, they're pretty smart, right? Adam's running around naming animals, and they can talk to each other, and they can talk to snakes and shit like that. But like the moment that they bite of this apple, they notice that they're naked. So from a cybernetic perspective, they go from mere people who are kind of thermostats, who are like tier 1 cybernetic agents. That is to say, they're intaking knowledge and they're applying the knowledge, and then then they're making a choice. They're intaking the knowledge, making a choice, outputting an action, and they go to being self-reflexive. So they become a second order cybernetic system. That is to say, within the decision-making unit, that has a cybernetic entity within itself. Or Douglas Hofstadter would say, you become a strange loop, right? A self-referential entity, essentially. And that's where the knowledge of all things starts to occur. If you're familiar with like set theory and stuff like that, it basically comes down to Russell's paradox is another example. Or Douglas Hofstadter says, think about it as a two mirrors reflecting back and forth at each other. That's kind of the way that your mind looks at itself in a certain way, right? So all of that to say that the key mistake was eating of that tree of knowledge of good and evil. Actually, I'm kind of realizing at this particular moment that like a common atheist rebuttal to like, well, how did Adam and Eve not know to follow God's will if blah blah blah? And it's like, well, did they need self-knowledge to be able to follow God's will, or did they need just knowledge that God was good and the snake was bad, right? And they kind of messed up. It's interesting, and the reason again why I kind of bring this particular tree up is that God then immediately freaks out about this other tree, which is the tree of life, aka the tree of eternal life. And God basically says, oh shit, if these beings eat both of the knowledge of the A to Z of all things, basically of all matters, and of the tree of life, they'll basically be gods, which essentially is, in our current modernist parlance, super intelligent AIs, right? They know everything and they're capable of living forever. That is the ancient Hebrew Bible definition of God. Like that's his definition of himself, right? And so he's like, okay,
Yeah.
But yeah, of course, right. This is from the occultist perspective.
No, keep going.
Yes.
I'm not trying to stop you. This is, I think, last time we've talked about, one of the ideas behind our project around the weird right is that people of very disparate worldviews can find common ground and maybe say the same thing, means something different, but it still works. I think I agree. I really like what you've written here. I really like listening to your perspective. I'm not trying to cut you off in any way. I'm not going to.
Oh, for sure.
I would probably have some very, yeah. I mean, no, I'm not an expert on Jewish understandings about Garden of Eden or the fall at all. But I do know that they're quite different from Christian understandings, and that's okay. Like, that's fine to be different.
For sure.
And I would,
well, and to be clear, my notions aren't even mainstream Jewish ones. Mine are specifically like Kabbalistic ones. So it's like mystic. Yeah. Like, yeah.
No, I would as a Protestant and specifically somebody who really appreciates Kierkegaard, I think I would disagree with a lot of what you said, but I still enjoy hearing it. And guess what? Because in the end, it doesn't really matter, because in the end, the idea, the goal, like I said before, but I'll say it again, is not for compliance or right, 2 + 2 = 5. That's not the goal. The goal is to find, principles, at least as written. I totally agree with it. We might view what the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is very differently, but it doesn't matter, right? We recognize that, like, we could have very different understandings of what sin is, but we both recognize that it's very much a problem. And
right. Yeah. Because sin is essentially disorder, right? Like, right. In a certain way.
I'm going to bring up, I'm going to bring him up because I was already going to bring him up. I've already brought him up. Kierkegaard would say that, I'm not saying that everything Kierkegaard said was like amazing, but a lot of what he said was pretty freaking amazing. So he had some serious depression issues, but who in Denmark doesn't? It's very dark and a lot of the year. Just saying.
They didn't have pot back then either.
No, they had coffee. He was very much into coffee, which was probably the closest thing. But no, Kierkegaard, like, for example, in his book Repetition, right, would talk, and it's all throughout his other works too. The idea that, like, for Kierkegaard, the problem is not necessary. The main problem is not sins. The problem is sin, right? So, like, a lowercase s sin versus an uppercase s sin. So, like, an uppercase s sin for Kierkegaard really would be defined as something like, again, I'm condensing it drastically here, but something like the repetition of fallenness, right? It's okay, I did the bad thing, okay, I receive forgiveness, but then I keep doing the bad thing, and it is this perpetual state of fallenness, that it keeps working itself out as a round and around and around cycle. That is what sin is in a Kierkegaardian understanding, which, again, I don't think it's the only way to view sin that's productive, but it is interesting because it gives you the sense of the habituality of it. That if you are a fallen creature, and again, this is also how you know that Kierkegaard is really, he railed a lot against the state church of Denmark, but he's very much in the Lutheran tradition. Like, this is not this cyclical nature of sin is something that you can't break out of, at least not on your own. And that is very much a thing, as the kids say. So yeah. I'm not even necessarily disagreeing with what you're saying. I guess I would just say from my perspective, the question of breaking, I don't know if you can break out of it. I think that's part of the problem of life, right? That you are born and you suffer and you die. And particularly from a Christian perspective, that this is a result, particularly from a Protestant perspective too. I'll qualify several times here, just so I'm not making sure I'm not speaking for anyone that I'm not supposed to, right? Speaking for my tribe, this is a consequence of something that you both did do and something that you didn't do. It's a consequence of something you didn't do in the sense of that you were born into a fallen world and therefore have suffered, right, the effects of original sin. But it is also your fault in that you do miss the mark, right? You do not do the things you should always do, and you do things that you shouldn't do. And that no one no mortal is exempt from this. It does, and I think a lot of times, I'll just finish it up with this. A lot of times people mischaracterize, particularly Protestant teachings of sin, as sort of incredibly harsh and incredibly brutal. And I only think that's because we like to tell ourselves that we're good people. We're just like Jerry Seinfeld in that one episode where he tries to help the guy. With the restaurant, I am a good person. Yeah, except just like Jerry Seinfeld in that episode, you're not always a good person, and you do sometimes mess things up. It's one of my favorite episodes of Seinfeld, by the way. But I think it's just, for me, one of the main reasons why I'm Protestant is because it's at least the sense of like their anthropology, like the understanding of human nature. It's accurate. It's accurate. It's like it explains the things around me. I'm like, why is it that I mess up? Why is it that other people mess up? Oh, it's almost like there's this cycle that we're stuck in. So I guess for me, anti-entropy weapons, I'm all for it, right? I'm not disagreeing with you. I don't know if the anti-entropy weapons for me would be something like, how do we preserve, and I'm going to use the word on purpose, retard the effects of the breakdown, right? How do we retard entropy as much as possible? That was for a soundbite, but that's okay. Sometimes you do this. And that's so it's a hyper kind of realistic expectation.
Well,
I don't think my one thing is, I don't think our anti-entropy weapons are only for defense against the onslaught of the orcs. But unless Gandalf crests the hill and brings something, meaning unless we receive help from outside of ourselves, hey, anti-entropy weapons are great, right? It's not that you should just lay down your arms and go, well, screw it, we're all going to be dead anyhow. It's like, well, that's dumb. Don't do that. But be very recognize, I think, as the weird right. This is, I guess, what I posit to you, Elliott. I think we should make sure that we're very realistic and humble about what we can do and what we can't do. And that I think that's important. So again, I'm not even really disagreeing with you. I'm just saying, I'm being that guy who's like, you might want to consider that, right? Because I'll give you just one more thing. So anti-entropy, right? I try to do as much anti-entropy in my life as possible, right? But I also recognize that there are times when I try to do an anti-entropy thing and it actually ends up making entropy happen. And I go, oh, I totally didn't see that happening. I had the best intentions, but it not only did it not help, it made things worse. So I guess that's sort of you've given the gospel and I've given the law a bit here, to borrow some like, yeah, but be careful because there's limits to what you can do. Yeah. So but I think that I've anticipated something you were already going to say, because
and I think this is all very good. So go ahead.
As people who find themselves on the right, we recognize that there are limitations, right? There's a limit to what humans are capable of doing, and maybe there's probably should be a limit to what humans should do, right? Because we can't fix everything, right? There's real life, and then there's what we want, and sometimes they overlap and sometimes they don't, right? Wouldn't it be nice if there was no harm and suffering and death in the world? Like, I think unless you're a complete sociopath or you've completely summoned Cthulhu into your life, there are people like that. I think a lot of people would agree with that. The problem comes to, down to like, well, how do you implement that? And I do think that one of the defining factors, aside from the hierarchy and hierarchy of hierarchies, one of the defining things of people on the right is that there's a sense of like limit. We can only do so much, right?
There's a sense of boundary, like lines exist, right?
But even just like even just limits exist.
Yes, exactly.
Right? Like there's maybe there's the things you shouldn't do, but then there's the things you should do, and there's the things you should do that you just can't.
Right.
It's not all the time.
And then the things that you ought to do that maybe won't have the effect. Maybe it's a hopeless thing, but you do it anyway, right?
Right. Yeah, and maybe doing the anti-entropy doesn't fix the world, but guess what? It's almost like it wasn't up to you to fix the world. It's almost like it was just up to you to keep trying to do anti-entropy.
Right. And
again.
I would also
that's also part of Kierkegaard's idea of repetition. That right. So you have this repetition of sin, and it's a problem, but you also ideally, faith allows you to have repetition in God. And that God continually finds you yet again, and brings you back yet again, and yet again. And so it's not just a depressing woe is me cycle of sin type thing. It's also this cycle of grace type thing. And that there's tension between these two cycles. And that's kind of what at least for Kierkegaard, that's like sort of what the idea of faith is that it's this tension thing. That it's not this like, oh, once you believe everything is easy. It's like, no, it's actually really hard now. because now you're very acutely aware of all the ways that things are not right. And you have to all the more, you know, you have to double, triple down on finding the anti-entropy, finding the white pill in everything, right? Because otherwise you'll just spiral, right? So anyhow.
No, and of course, I also wouldn't necessarily say any of that is a rebuttal to anything I've said, which is good, which is good.
It's a meta comment. It's a yeah. I don't know.
No, but just to clarify, because I think a lot of people get very tribalist about this, especially amongst like say Lutherans and or random occultists like myself, like Kabbalists, and they try to be like, oh, any way of interpreting this in an orthodox way or any way of interpreting this occult way is objectively wrong. I'm like, hey, what we're trying to do here is write stuff that is understandable to both sides in their own ways and could be implemented by both sides. And one of the things, as an example, I would give in terms of anti-entropy weapons is habits, right? Habits are an example of this, right? They help ensure things don't fall apart. Your body is an example of this. Anything that has homeostasis is an anti-entropy weapon, right? So tradition is another anti-entropy weapon. The church would be another example, or any tradition of any sort, any body that kind of maintains itself. And, and of course, the best, most important anti-entropy weapon is the meme of memes, right? The logos.
Yeah, the logos. Right.
Which literally brings chaos, brings order from chaos, which is to say the creation of the world.
Right. Yeah. Well said. Well said. Since I've already started bogarting, I always say, I give you the floor, and then I always lie. So see, there's a problem there.
It's a give and take.
It's a give and take. I always lie. I do my best. It's not with the best of intentions. So I'm going to let Elliott talk. And then I'm like, but there's this thing I really want to say. And this is why Elliott's very gracious, and there's a give and take, and that's okay. If I may,
go ahead.
I've already brought him up. Kierkegaard also had this quote. So this is something that I added. So everything up until now, up until my spiel there, was Elliott, and I was just responding to Elliott. But again, this is a we collaborate on this. Thinking about time war, and I'm slowly working my way through the land piece. He's a very interesting writer, and it takes a lot of time to really get what he means. But I thought about, as I always do, right? In the end, it always comes back to like Tolkien and Kierkegaard for me, and that's just autistic fanboy that I am. But there's this really often quoted bit from Kierkegaard that I think really, despite its popularity online, it's still really profound, and it really fits right here. And that's this quote that life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. So right, we live into the unknown, right, into the future. We don't know. I don't know what's going to happen now, right? That was just 1 second. I don't know what's going to happen. So there's like this idea of like living forward. You don't know what's coming, so you're living into the future, but you're understanding into the past. And now Kierkegaard I do not think Kierkegaard was writing about a time war and Cthulhu, but, in the spirit of being a wandering humanist and making connections and forging connections where there are thematic connections, I think there's a thematic connection here. Namely that, this is just true, right? Like, who can understand into the future? You don't do that. No, like nobody does that, right? Like you understand what has you attempt to understand what happened to you, right? Even if it's just throughout the course of this conversation, right? That is an attempt to make sense of and evaluate what happened, the past, what is good, what is bad, what could be better, what do we want more of, right? That's how human minds work. And then I would argue from a weird right perspective, that's an innately right-wing thing. And it's interesting because in this quote, which again, Kierkegaard did not originally mean in this way, but that's how we're using it. We're weird. We're doing it. The future is the unknown. So, the people who are the cult of Cthulhu are attempting to bring in the unknown, right? Which is chaotic and dark. And why do they do this? For maybe just because they're nihilists and it's exhausting to be a nihilist, and maybe they just want it all to be done, right? I think that's part of it. And we've talked about this in previous episodes. I think also part of it is they just want the promise of what the unknown would be. Ooh, what will that be like? What could we do? Right? There's so many things that we could do. They project ideas of what the future progress, the Enlightenment will be, right? Of course, we're in the Enlightenment, but they want more of it.
Well, right.
But in reality,
They
can't
kind of
know.
hate their current manifestation, right?
Yeah,
I always like to
they
say
want
that
something.
liberals would have continued to wander. They would have led Moses wandering in the desert forever, and
Forever.
conservatives would have sat down in the desert, right? The weird right just goes to the fucking promised land.
Yeah, right. Yes, the weird right, it recognizes that there's a necessary acceleration, in this case desert wandering, that has to happen. You can't get around it, otherwise you're stuck in the either what otherwise you're just perpetually in the desert, or you're sitting down, none of which are very useful in the moment. Right, like it's not going to give you what you need in the end. But anyhow, right, the looking to the future. So what could the future mean? And again, we should probably specify, we don't mean that like people in the weird right don't want a good future. Of course, I think most sane human beings do want a good future. What we mean is future, capital F, like the future, right? Like
Right. Well, it's important to
as progress. And we don't even mean progress in the sense of getting better. We mean Coca-Cola presents progress trademark. This kind of
and I think
progress. That's
one of the huge things that informs me on this sort of thing is viewing history in a totally different way. 1984, a lot of people have to read, but they read like when they're way too young and they don't really get everything that's going on, which isn't condescension. I'm just saying, like, if I had read in high school, I wouldn't have understood everything either, because when I read it like as an anarchist, I was like, oh shit, I get everything that's going on here. This is way scarier than people realize. One of the scary things that I realized was happening is that there's a critical piece where Winston is given a book. And by the way, screw you if you're anti-spoilers, go read freaking 1984. You gotta be goddamn kidding me over here. But anyway, point being is Winston gets a book, right? And the book straight up says the party uses, they warp the past to shape the present, because he who controls the past controls the present, and he who controls the present controls the future, right? Yeah. So there is a very important thing in which like entropy weapons have been deployed about at the past. Yep. Both in terms of our mythologies, which disordered the mythologies relative to our durational time of the present, right? And it sort of took out the mythical past and the mythical future that we had, and instead inserted somebody else's mythical past and future, which is the Hegelian dialectic and the Marxist dialectic, right? And fuck Hegel. Hegel is literally the most evil person.
No, and this is also why, Kierkegaard was so anti-Hegelian. It's beautiful. Yeah.
It's super based. Yeah. Hegel, like, as an occultist, I say that Hegel is one of the most evil occultists of all time. And unless you,
as a non-occultist, I would agree with you. I think of him as a dark lord on a dark tower, a dark throne on a dark tower in a dark land where shadows lie.
Yeah, exactly. Who's freaking zeitgeist is ever present with us. Yep. But essentially, like, the Enlightenment thinkers, especially like Hegel, detached us from these balancing mythical points in the past and future, right? That allowed us to stay stable in the present, and instead permanently destabilized us, right? Using this Marxist mode, right? This Marxist framework.
And trying to continually, like with the whole analogy or metaphor, really, of summoning Cthulhu, right? Because you've destabilized everything, at least, vis-a-vis what you've done, or you've destabilized everything by what you've done to the past, you are with the only option you have is to draw in the future, and whatever that is. And of course it's the future that you want, and of course it's the future that that actually ironically leads to more destabilization, but then you need more of it, and so it's this like runaway train at some point. And
right, because notice that in many old-timey mythical stories, cyclic time happened in the past, right? And then either the ancestors have happened, and so in the future it linearizes out, right? So to speak, or in the Christian sense, you go to heaven or whatever, or you're a Buddhist and you become enlightened, and you smooth out the circle, right? What the left has done is they make the past the line and the future is the circle, right? So you'll notice that the WEF even specifically states that we want a circular economy, right? And if you're familiar with Mises, which, by the way, land draws off of the Austrian tradition, by the way. So if you're an Austrian, you'll like land too. But anyway, point being is that the communism specifically is trying to even things out, to end history, right? Hegelians of all stripes are
it wasn't just
with ending history.
Well, yeah, and it's funny because all these, sorry, I'm gonna rant. All these fucking
go ahead.
All these fucking neocons like Fukuyama are talking about the end of history. I'm like, oh, so you are a communist, you are exactly. A Marxist.
Hegelian, right?
Well, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, no, that's what the neocons are. Anyhow, rant aside, sorry, but that's
well, the neocons are descended from Trotsky, which are internationalist Marxists, right, as opposed to nationalist Marxists who are Stalinists, right? I don't need to be technically
all right. Yes. Yeah.
Well, I don't even need to be, I'm actually about it. It's just to like clarify that many cons, if you didn't know, are literally ex-Trotskyites, right? Yeah. Like, just to be clear on that point, like it's not even crazy to call them communists, because they actually are kind of bizarro right-wing communists.
And that's when I say like Bush is like one of the biggest liberal, one of the Bush biggest liberals. And when I say I'm against liberals, I mean I'm against Bush. I mean, obviously it's a troll, but it's also true. And I'm like, people have a hard time understanding that one because it's like,
well, and this is
what he's doing.
And this is where Trump, even though I don't think Trump is even mildly coherent, he's like one of the only right-wingers to have ever been president in the last 100 years.
In the last 100 years or so, pretty much. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Everybody else has been nominally left-wing.
I mean, well, yeah, nominally left-wing, but 100% shit libs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Like liberal in this Enlightenment sense, 100%.
Right. Which by the way, I know a lot of libertarians might be grumpy about, but I'm like, hey, to those libertarians who are very sincere about that critique, instead of trying to defend the libertarian Enlightenment tradition, you need to come up with, right? Help me come up with a postmodern libertarian thing to drag us into the current era, because all kind of libertarians are waking up to the fact the left libs libertarians got this first, which is like there's a full synthesis between corporate and state, and the right libertarians are starting to wake up to this post-COVID when they're realizing, oh snap, or post fun times, we'll say, where they're like, oh, there's a synthesis between corporations and state. And so like the modernist notion of the separation of markets and state is barely even coherent when you have Amazon rings being sold to willing buyers that then the state buys, footage off of Amazon that Amazon willingly sells them. Well, the First and Second Amendments literally don't even apply in that situation, right? Like, how could they apply? And so it's like, well, dude, that doesn't help to continue to cite this founding document, which literally is an Enlightenment document. We're not in Enlightenment anymore. We're post-Enlightenment now. We are postmodern, right? Yeah. So that being said, it's like, hey, I'm not saying that you should abandon anarchy or that you should abandon classical liberalism. We need a postmodern liberalism, right? That's not like shit lib. So anyway, regardless, please aside.
Yeah. No. Yeah. No. I think you're a little bit more conciliatory towards those libertarians, but that's fine, right? Like I'm exactly. We'll take anybody. We're weird. We'll take anybody. You're welcome. I mean, just be willing to leave. Again, it's like I say, I'm not even anti-liberal. Right. I'm just post-liberal. Like it's not the world we live in, and I'm not gonna say it didn't do some good things, but it's definitely doing bad things now. And so I do, the bathwater must be thrown out. Please, oh please don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's save the baby, or as much of the baby as we can. I don't think it's impossible to grab the child before you dump the water out, right? Like
it's not crazy. Parents do it all the time.
Yeah, no, for real. There's this real autistic either or thing. You get people on the left who are like, we got to keep everything, even though the child is literally drowning in its own filth water. And then you get people on the right who are like, chuck the whole thing because it was always bad. And you're like, there's a child in there.
Including
how about
the container and the sink.
Including the container and the house, and it's turtles all the way down, and it's never good. I'm like, okay, well, what does that get you? It gets you, you're missing a bathtub, but most importantly, you're missing a child that was kind of a precious creation. So, you know, if the child here is something like, if the child here is something to be read like, you know, human flourishing, you know, that's fine that the child was cleaned for a while, but it's floundering in the waters now. It's been, you know, by the way, everyone, if you're going to bathe children, make sure you're watching them. Don't let them drown, right? You have to pull them out at some point, right? Like, and even if the child's not drowning, like I said, the water's pretty dirty. So they took a poo. They went poo in the water. Don't let your children swim in filth. Let's pull them out and clean them off, and that's okay. And you drain the tub. You know, I don't know. Obviously, easier said than done in that, and you know, metaphor. But is it worth trying? I think it's worth trying. And again, I think this is maybe hitting at the crux of the weird right, at least for me. And I would imagine for you too, as Elliott, is like, you know, one need not chuck the child out with the bathwater, but please, oh please, let's get rid of the bathwater because it stinks.
Right. Well, yeah, and you know, there's a lot of in this metaphor of people wringing their hands. I'm like, hey, have you considered just grabbing the child?
Yeah. Have you considered saving the child? Yeah. I don't know.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you actually have to, you mean you plural, anyone, where you actually have to like intervene on behalf of somebody who's having like a life-threatening event happen. But like, it is interesting that there's the people who go, oh, and then there's the people who just run in and do shit. And they're like, well, you didn't follow all the protocols. It's like, yeah, but we did something. We did.
Yeah, great example.
Everyone else was like, oh, yeah.
I was taking an exit on a freeway, right? And there was a parked car and people were going around the parked car. And I was like, I was about to go around it, but I noticed, I was like, dude, this car doesn't even have hazards on. So I parked and I noticed that the driver was kind of slumped over. I was like, oh shit. So I like parked my car, run up to the thing, bang on the window. The guy like wakes up and drives off. I'm like, okay, like not really the optimal solution, because like now that I know this guy is like falling asleep on fucking red lights, but whatever, like he's not dead, right? Because at that point, it's like, yeah, technically speaking, the illegal rules would have been like, oh yeah, you can't park on the street. It's like, bro, it's beyond this. There's a human that's in need, right? So you just do at that point, right? So yeah.
No, perfect analogy right there, right? Like, yeah, it's like the protocols are important, right? Again, where the weird right is right. The protocols are important, but the humans, the human flourishing is the most important. And by human flourishing, we don't mean some sort of fake gay and cringe. I'll say it. Yeah, I'm bi, I can say it. Fake gay and cringe.
But think Epicurean flourishing, right?
Yeah,
like go read some virtue ethicists.
Aristotelian flourishing, like a life that is purposeful. And by the way, that can be fun too. Purpose can be fun.
Well, as we all know, nihilism is not fun.
It's not fun. It's exhausting, as we know. A life that is that gives back to the society that it's a part of, but also receives from the society it's a part of. Again, people start freaking out. That sounds pretty lefty. I'm like, not really. You know,
it's only lefty because the left has defined the right as extraction, which is ridiculous.
It is ridiculous. But anyhow, yeah. No, let's saving the child out of the bathwater is what's really important, right? Like, that's the number. And just like with if a child is floundering in a pool, you save the child first, right? Like you save the child first, and then you figure out, okay, granted, then you're going to have a bathtub of shitty water, and you got to deal with that too. But like, is there a way to get the child out first? Okay, and maybe in this instance is to, and we keep using this metaphor. Maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't, but it's where we're going tonight. You know, maybe that first step of pulling the child out of the bathwater is going, maybe the bathwater is dirty. Meaning, like maybe the you know, enlightenment has become dirty. Maybe it's not good. How about pulling the child out is maybe just that's a little bit like you know, Yarvin's red pill. Oh, it's not making the world better. Oh, it's almost like the military-industrial complex is a direct result of the Enlightenment, and that kills a lot of people. wait a second,
Right.
it's
And
having
it's
these
not
moments.
necessarily technology either, right?
Right.
There's an enlightenment, because there's a Renaissance notion of technology, right? Like, and there's a Roman notion of technology, right? The issue is like we had technology paired with many different revolutions all at the same time, which are kind of lumped all together, right? And this actually gets to a really interesting Nick Land quote too, which I can't quote quite off the top of my head, but basically it's like, you know, the compass, the compass, and wow, it's not quite this, but essentially the compass and double entry bookkeeping, right, conquered the world, which is accurate, right?
Pretty much, if you think about it.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, and so those two things could have conquered the world. Well, what are the key parts of the Enlightenment that conquered philosophical world and kind of kicked us off course? Well, it was radical materialism, right? Not necessarily the scientific material.
Not reason per se, but radical. Yeah. What people did with reason. Yeah. I would say divorcing reason from less reasonable parts of life, such as any sort of faith, any in the transcendent, in the mystical, in the mythical, in any of those.
In trying to eliminate faith, right?
This
was the
why
problem.
have families? Why have families? They why that's like an emotional thing. That's not, right? Like hyper rationalism. Yeah. No, it really ruined things.
And it's ruined all of us, and it's sort of like, it's sort of like deconstructionism has been, which, by the way, our next bullet point is meme weaponry deconstructs deconstructionism.
Yeah.
But deconstructionism, like, is not necessarily that's yep, exactly. That's
all of the very like cool Landian points are Elliott, and all the like this thing is Collin, and you could probably tell based on our ways of talking that you can when we publish it, you'll get it. Everyone will be able to see who wrote what. We won't even have to say.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah, it's very different writing styles. Yeah,
they'll be able to tell the scholar from the poet very quickly.
This thing is this thing. Yeah. Anyhow, continue. Yeah.
No. So yeah, basically.
Yeah.
So I mean, I only read that because I was going to mention deconstruction briefly, which is to say deconstructionism isn't necessarily evil per se, just like extreme acids are not evil per se, right? But if you're flinging acids in people's faces, it's not good, bro. It's unethical, right? And there's some shit that ought not to be deconstructed, like people's tires out from under them, right?
Yeah, don't
like
do that.
There's some things that ought to remain constructed, at least for the time being, right? And so like there's this notion that I have anyway, which is that look, when I was a kid and I was skeptical of everything, right? The problem is that people are inconsistent at applying these sorts of acidic acids, right? And most of them, when it comes to philosophy, don't apply the acids to themselves, right? So deconstructionism, when you deconstruct it, falls apart. Obviously, it must necessarily. Same thing with skepticism. When you become skeptical of skepticism, you're freed of being perfectly skeptical of everything, right? But there's these people who want to kind of channel and weaponize skepticism by wrapping it in faith, and it's a skeptic faith, and the new atheists would be grumpy about that, but it's true, because unless you methodically apply skepticism to itself, as soon as you do that, you're like, well, hold on, now I need to be skeptical. Well, what do I have aside from skepticism now that I'm literally skeptical of everything? Well, hold on, I took quite a leap of, wait for it, faith, in accepting skepticism.
And Elliott, guess who invented that phrase?
Exactly, right. It was Kierkegaard, right? So I was quite amused and pleased with myself that I was coming up with some sophisticated Kierkegaardian philosophy. Right?
It's another anecdote, just briefly. I don't know if you know who Timothy Ware is. Callistos Ware was an Englishman who became Greek Orthodox, and sort of is known as one of these sort of communicators to Western Christians about what Eastern Christians believe. And he has this anecdote. I forget which book it's in. Actually, no, I think it was in one of his lectures that I heard. He's talking about, like when I was a child, it was a very similar thing to you. When I was a child, I went through this phase where I just couldn't believe. I could only believe in things that I could test, right? So a hyper rationalist phase. And so I temporarily gave up believing in God and all these other things, but then I realized that how could I prove that my mother loved me? And I couldn't, but I still knew she did. because I experienced it. And then that snapped him out of it. So it's kind of a similar idea in that, right? Like if you take this skeptical or hyper rational mindset to its logical conclusion, it breaks apart, right? This is the anti-entropy weapons breaking apart deconstructionism. Like it falls apart because that's what it does. It by definition falls apart or breaks apart.
Right. And of course, like I'm not meaning this to claim that therefore God or therefore whatever. I'm just saying, like, when people try to say, oh, be skeptical, therefore atheism, they're actually completely wrong, right? Like skepticism only gets you, to doubting things. It doesn't get you to believing anything in particular.
Yeah, no, and again, since we're in a hyper Kierkegaardian mode here, doubt is in many ways doubt's a necessary component of faith, because you're actually struck again. It's that tension of the two different cycles, right? Of Kierkegaard's repetition, right? Like that's where the tension happens. It means that you're actually experiencing faith on an active emotional level, like you're actually experiencing faith. That it's a struggle. That it's not easy. That it is hard. I do have doubts. This is part of it. That's part. I'm going to speak to your crowd, Elliott. It's a feature, not a bug. I do my best to communicate across the aisle, as it were, to the computational peoples. So maybe we start slowly turning the ship a bit, and wrap it up a bit. So time war. So let's connect everything that we've said here back to this notion of time war. Again, seeking to construct as opposed to deconstruct. Right? Kierkegaard says that, right, life must be lived forwards, but we must understand it backwards. We understand it backwards, and understanding provides structure, like a pattern, like we look at what is good and what is bad. This does not mean that everything in the past was good. That is a very weak leftist jab against anyone who values tradition in any way, shape, or form. It does not mean that. That is really dumb. What it means is that we don't throw away the past. The past structures our lives. And it's almost like in the process of attempting to structure our life and figure out what is good and what is bad, the opus proprium and opus alienum, to reference earlier episodes. It's almost like in doing that, the logos is in action, but we experience this by looking to the past. And I think, at least for me, that's what I'm getting out of this whole notion of time war as we're applying it to the weird right. So as best I could, that's summarizing my thoughts there. Yeah.
No, exactly. And this basically is summarizing kind of the header this episode. There's some what I feel are interesting bullet points, which we have a tiny bit of disagreement on, because I was jabbing at the Protestants a little bit, but that's okay.
Yeah, the other way. No, right. We like being jabbed at. We are literally, so we are a tradition born out of assholes. No, like literally academic assholes who are like, no, you're wrong. And I'm going to gamble everything on this. That is what Protestantism, that's at least
Protestants, they're meant to be prodded. They're Protestants.
Yeah, Protestants. Yes, well said. Yeah, and and the trad Caths will say they're meant to be protested. Yeah, okay, fine.
Right.
Yeah,
well, so the kind of like one thought I have around thinking along these lines is an interesting thing I feel that falls out of once you start thinking about the right as explicitly moving backwards in times. So some of the things that I was thinking about that aren't really written down here necessarily, which is to say that what would it look like if you had a moving backwards in being and a moving forwards in being trying to communicate with each other? You know what I mean? Like, what would that look like? Just or fighting with each other, right? Like, so just meditate on that, I guess, was what I would say.
Yeah,
the other thing I would like to say,
Elliott, there's a movie I've been trying to get you to watch that meditates on this for 2.5 hours called Tenet. Yeah, anyhow, yeah.
exactly. So there's that. And then the other thing I had a pithy quote that I kind of like, which is that the right can predict the future but can't do anything to change it, and the left cannot see the future but changes it anyway, right? Well, and I think I think that pretty much accurately articulates the things, right? It's hilarious because the left is like, oh no, it won't do this, it won't do that, and the visionaries of the left will say that's what we're trying to do.
Quantitative easing won't do anything, and the right's like, but it has fucked shit up in the past. Let's not try it again. What are we doing right now?
Exactly. Like, let's not try this particular revolution again, because we know where this revolution ends. It ends right here. And this is where it feels like some of this philosophy feels like a little bit of pun chasing, right? But frankly, look at the word revolution, right? A revolution necessarily ends up back at the same place, you dumbass, right? You don't get anywhere with a revolution. You just turn things over to revolve. Think about it, right? Like, if you want to move forward, you have to move past revolution, right? And how do you move past revolution? You institute patterns that are time-space crystals, right? Which you're like, oh, Elliot, what is that? Well, go look up time-space crystals. It turns out they're real. And when you understand what a crystal is, it's a lattice structure. Originally, it was thought of as a lattice structure just in space. But by the way, a crystal is an anti-entropy situation. It naturally creates order out of a disordered thing. So think about that for a moment. And then when you have a time crystal, right, this is a tradition or a habit, essentially. And then a space-time crystal is a crystal form that is a habit, right? And so I think that one of the most critical one of the most critical anti-entropy weapons is space-time crystals, which are expressed through memes and genes, which essentially is a nice tee-up for the rest of the little bullet points underneath this times war section.
Yeah. I think that's a good way to end it right there. Again, we thank you for your understanding. Pardon our mess, as they say. This is very much a work in progress, and so again, like I've said before, but I'll say it again. Repetition's important, as Kierkegaard would say. We're ironing things out. We're actively working on stuff. This will end up being a published work, however long it ends up being. Probably a little bit longer than I think you and I both anticipated, Elliot. But these the episodes are designed to help us work through it, but also hopefully entice people into wanting to know more about it. With that being said, like, comment, subscribe, all those things. Elliot, I'm just asking out of habit. Anything new that you would like to bump or tell people about on the that you've been doing outside of this?
Not that I've been doing.
The platform.
I would plug, if you're interested into him, Milo Yiannopoulos came back on to Timcast.
Timcast, I saw that.
So go look that up. That's super interesting.
I saw his fish flip-flops. That was the height of the show.
That was the height of the show.
And the glasses.
By the way, part of the reason why I also bring up Milo is that he gave, even when he was being flamboyantly gay, a really interesting defense of Catholicism.
Yes.
Not that I'm pro-Catholic or nothing. I was just like, it's fascinating that Milo understood Catholicism. Literally, I was reading Catholic bloggers, and they're like, "Holy shit, this is literally one of the best descriptions I've ever seen."
And I guess my 2 cents on that is just I view, again, a lot of these people are fellow travelers. They're trad Catholic, or in Milo's case, hyper gay trad Catholic. I don't really know how that works
now.
Right, that's how that works. Yeah, I wish I could dress that nice.
Exactly. Even as straight, right?
fellow travelers, again, in the weird right way, they're heading in a way that they're heading away from entropy. I can recognize that. While I don't necessarily, obviously by definition, Protestant, don't necessarily hitch my horse completely to their specific wagon. I'm definitely on the wagon train in the same direction, right? I get that. And who doesn't want fish flip-flops? I want some now. I wonder where you can get some now. Anyhow, I might actually link to that as well. That was actually a really fun episode. Yeah, I listened to that the other day too. You can follow me on Twitter at Altphilologe. I know it's a German word and that's confusing, but I'll type it in the chat if you're interested. I blog occasionally for Carpe Forum. A couple weeks ago, I turned our episode on the Peace and the Feud into a blog article. I'm planning on turning, actually, I think this Time War into would actually translate well into a blog article.
Nice.
So that will be coming up. I'm going to be doing that. So there's a nice cross-pollination across a couple different groups. And some of you who watch the show know that Mitch and Marshall both have written, and Fred all have written for Carpe Forum. So there's a definite cross-pollination here. Yeah, that's about all I can think of. And with that, I think I'll wish everyone a very nice weekend. If you're in the northern regions, stay warm. It is getting a bit chilly. And if you're in the southern regions, enjoy your nice weather for a change. And yeah, we'll see y'all soon. Peace, everyone.
Bye.